My name is Marnie Shaw and I'm the chair of the ANU ICED's Women in Energy group. So this group is really a priority for the Institute, and we have two kind of main goals as a group. So the first one is we want to encourage more women into the energy industry. And the second main goal is that we really focused on how do we provide targeted support and also camaraderie for women who are already working in the energy sector. So this group, the Women in Energy group, is for everyone at the ANU, so both women and non-women, because as we all know, we really need to have everyone on board to achieve our goals as a group. So before I move on to introducing the speakers, I want to take a minute to acknowledge and celebrate the traditional owners of the lands that we're speaking on. So here at the ANU, that's the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. And given this is a Women in Energy group, I'd like to particularly acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri women. For me, I think particularly of Dr. Matilda House, who plays a really important role here at the ANU, and I think she's just a really great model of calm and thoughtful leadership for us all. So now I'll move on to introducing our two speakers. We're very fortunate to have you both. Thank you for coming. So Monique Miller is the Chief Investment Officer for Renewables and Sustainable Finance with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So for those unfamiliar with the CEFC, this is basically Australia's green bank. And they play a really important role, obviously, on the financial side of driving Australia's energy transition, and obviously completely crucial for us achieving our goals of 82% renewable electricity by 2030. So Monique studied here at the ANU. So perhaps for students in the audience and students online, I think Monique is a really excellent example of the kind of very, very impressive career you can have here with an ANU degree. Good advertisement for us. And I think she's also a great example of the fact that you often don't have to work in the field that you studied in. So as I understand, Monique studied sociology and literature and Australian film. That was the same for me. Like, I studied physics and neuroscience and ended up working in battery storage. So I think that's good for students to see those diverse pathways that are all really important for our industry. So at the CEFC, Monique leads the team responsible for billions of dollars of transactions in renewable energy storage and debt markets, including the new $1 billion Household Energy Upgrades Fund, which I'd be really interested to hear a bit more about. And I was also interested to read in your abstract that you said you would discuss opportunities for women in the historically male-dominated energy industry, and so that makes me think you might feel quite optimistic about a rebalancing of gender in our industry. So I'm very curious to hear more about that. I'd also like to introduce Professor Michelle Ryan, here in the front row, who is ANU's very own Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And we're really fortunate to have Michelle here for this discussion, because she's really leading the conversation worldwide on workplace gender inequality. If you Google search her name, you'll come up with articles from all around the world discussing and debating her ideas around how we increase gender equality. And what I find really interesting about the work of yours that I've seen is it's a real focus on doing that in an evidence-based way. So really thinking about how to assess whether our efforts in this space are really working. So yeah, fantastic to have you both here, and thanks for coming. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. So I'll pass over to you, Monique.
Very much, Marnie. Can everyone hear me? Thanks for having me. There are three things I'd like to get through to you in my time here today. First of all, you're all studying at an incredible time in the energy transition. 20-something years ago, when I started my career, the climate science was essentially the same, but the technical solutions were lacking. Today, the technologies we have to get that we need to get to net zero all exist, And one of the main challenges is finding enough clever and committed people to do the work. Based on my recent experience, which I can talk to, but also just looking across the room, I think that a lot of the clever and committed people will happen to be women, which is great. Second, it's okay if you still don't know what you want to do or how you're going to get there. I certainly didn't have a plan, and I still don't. I just love to do interesting things. The more senior I get, the more I realize that everyone is winging it to some extent. In fact, the world has never seen a change of this scale and this magnitude. So any armchair critics that are hugely confident that they have all the solutions, guarantee they're bluffing. Finally, it's okay to be different to those around you. It's sometimes uncomfortable, but it's okay. And true diversity at times of great change like this doesn't mean listening only to opinions that we're comfortable with. So those are my 3 messages. As Marnie mentioned, I did an English literature degree, so I've written you a story. So I was born quite a few years ago in Libya. I was born at an oil medical clinic that was really set up for treating men injured in gas pipeline explosions rather than Australian women giving birth. So my very first moments in the world were spent navigating cultural and gender norms at a time of super high pressure for all involved. And I've essentially continued to do that ever since. My parents were both adventurers, they're here today, and we bounced around all over the place. I went to 9 different schools by the time I turned 15, and we moved back to Canberra. As I was finishing high school, I didn't know what I wanted to do next. Watched a lot of Law and Order, so that looked like fun, so I decided to study law. But I'd actually always loved reading and writing, so I also studied English literature. My favourite assignment was a thesis on a Mad Max movie. In retrospect, having learned more about the climate science, it's a pretty sobering case study in climate adaptation. So at school, I was always fairly good at maths and science, but it never even crossed my mind to study finance or engineering. I'd seen plenty of female lawyers on TV and Law and Order, but on the banking side, I'd only watched Wolf of Wall Street. That's not particularly inclusive. And my perception of the energy industry was always teams of men in hard hats building snowy hydro. So in hindsight, I really believe that people's imagination of what they might become is influenced by the examples they see around them, and I'm a living example of that. So I chose arts law at ANU. I remember back in the day, one of my friend's boyfriends studied women's studies at ANU back in 1997. I didn't understand why he'd do that at all. I thought all that gender stuff had been solved by my grandmother or my mother years ago. So that's my little cotton socks. So toward the end of university, a friend mentioned she was applying for summer clerkships in Sydney. I love the beach. So 10 minutes to midnight, I submitted my form, and I was lucky enough to be offered a clerkship with Baker McKenzie to the big law firm. After a gap year, I ended up in a little startup team that was first starting to practice climate law and policy. My first day on the job, I was asked to write an advice on whether the New South Wales emissions trading scheme was constitutional. And my boss had promised we would submit the advice that afternoon. My first day, so I had 4 hours. Thankfully, Google had just been invented. And I emailed my favourite constitutional law lecturer at ANU, who laughed heartily and gave me some pointers on where to start. And so, although I was totally overwhelmed and I didn't have the time to do it perfectly, I did everything I could with the resources and the time I had, which is the story of my career and the story of every working mother. And come to think of it, it's the story of the energy transition as well. And as our practice grew, I remember meeting my first female bankers. So one of my clients was a French woman negotiating a big deal, and she was heavily pregnant with her 3rd child. And this was my first example of a woman with kids and a high-paced legal banking career. I had really thought it was a choice between one or the other. So I've now worked 20 years in industries which have largely been dominated by men who think in numbers, when I studied in the realm of words. So to be candid, sometimes I've felt a bit out of place. My voice sounds different to theirs when I'm passionate about something. It goes high and shrill, and it becomes the mum voice, which we all react to really viscerally. I've had 2 maternity leave breaks, and very often I'm the only woman in the room in my day job. But to be fair, I've also had the privilege to work with a group of kind and clever men throughout my career, from my bosses to my clients, to the men who quietly unpack the dishwasher in the morning without even mentioning it, because why is it the female secretary's job? There's some real gems out there. And what I really love now is that post-COVID, it's suddenly become acceptable for people, including fathers, to admit that they have kids, to publicly take on some of those caring responsibilities, to do the school pickups, to go to concerts, and to take on parental leave. And I can tell you from my personal experience, that's not always been easy for men either. The gender inequality cuts both ways, and men have been harshly judged for taking those risks in their career to focus in on their family. But I think now that the parenting can be a little bit more publicly shared openly, and then there's a lot more understanding of the mental load and how that can be shared, I really think that their kids subconsciously expect that equality from themselves and from their partners. And I really think that makes the world a better place for the next generation. So back to my career path. After meeting some great women and men bankers, I thought their jobs might be fun. So I talked to my boss and a few clients about going on a secondment into the commercial side. I had zero expertise other than I happened to be in an emerging industry where no one knew what they were doing because we were trading imaginary blocks of air. So one of my clients was Macquarie Bank. They invited me on a secondment to their new carbon trading team in London. I loved it, and I never went back to practicing law. Moved back to Australia and had my first child. Then the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, or the CEFC, where I work now, was set up 11 years ago. They were set up as part of the government's climate carbon price package at the time. We had $10 billion to invest in the climate and energy transition, and I thought that sounded like a fun place to be. I joined on day one that the organisation was set up. I thought it would be a 6-month contract because while I worked out what I wanted to do when I grew up. So some of you might remember the CEFC was set up under a huge political storm cloud, with the incoming government wanting to close us down as they dismantled the carbon price. A small group of staff, supported by a really gutsy board, stared down the government's strong wish that we didn't exist. We just kept politely doing our job under the legislation while the legislation was in place. And in one of the more surreal collaborations I've ever seen, CEFC was rescued at a joint press conference between Al Gore and Clive Palmer after somebody had arranged for them to have dinner. So that dinner must have been quite the example of how the power of storytelling can change someone's mind and change the trajectory of a whole industry. It's now 11 years since I started at CEFC. We've successfully invested over $12 billion, completed more than 300 transactions, built 5 gigawatts of renewables generation, and for every dollar we have invested, we've crowded in $2.80 of private sector capital along the way. There was now about 150 staff, and last year I was appointed to the executive team to help lead the next decade. So if you remember the 3 points I made at the beginning, hope the story I've just told you covers off some of the reasons that I think these are the 3 most important. In case you don't remember, I'll touch on them backwards now. The first, it's okay to be different. It's okay to stand out and not look like the workers or the leaders that you work with, but it's not always comfortable. Growing up, I experienced feeling different and uncomfortable as a foreigner in new countries, being thrown in the deep end to learn the culture and to try and build personal relationships with people that were nervous of that change. This set me up for feeling different, but still prepared to build understanding and relationships in the male-dominated industries of energy and finance. Over the course of your career, for those here that are just starting it, you will be unfairly judged by people around you. Particularly as a woman, you'll inevitably be told you're not enough or you're too much. It's very hard to walk that middle line. It's so important that your first instinct isn't to judge back. In fact, it's really dangerous to assume that just because someone doesn't think like you, that they're stupid or they're evil. Usually, they're struggling with change and trying to work out how to feel safe, making a decision where the ground doesn't feel stable. As an example, I've spent my entire career battling climate change. My dad and a number of his friends are staunch climate skeptics. They grew up in a different era And lots of things they say aren't politically correct and would give my HR department an aneurysm. Our family barbecues are lots of fun, but they are some of the kindest people I know, and they still buy solar panels and they buy EVs and they nag their kids to turn off the lights. So I still look for the common ground. Arguing with my dad over almost everything my whole life, and seeing him love my mum but argue politics with her all the time as well, has set me up well in my career. I can make my point concisely in a negotiation or a policy discussion, but not take personal offence if someone strongly disagrees with me. And I try to make the room feel safe enough for us to be able to put down our swords and go for a drink afterwards. And it's funny that over a coffee or a drink, you often end up finding more common ground than you did when you were thumping the negotiation table. Sometimes you even find a solution you can both live with. Second, it's okay if you don't know what you want to do or you can't see how you're going to get there. My career consists of falling into opportunities I didn't expect and then just making the absolute most of them with the time and the resources that I had. With technology changing so quickly, I can't even imagine what the workplace will look like when you're all 20 years into your own careers. But I do know that strong personal relationships and communication skills will never go out of style. Finally, it's an incredible time in the energy transition. Change is scary, but it's exciting. In my career lifetime, climate change has gone from passionate greenies shouting alarm from the sidelines to a central consideration for governments, board members, and investors around the world. Last year, there was $1.3 trillion invested in the global energy transition, and that needs to at least triple. There are lots of hard skills necessary to help us navigate the transition, engineering not being the least of them, but don't underestimate the importance of being able to reach out to people that think differently to you and to be able to tell a story. I'm glad that my childhood and my time here at ANU helped me with those skills. There are so many amazing people and increasingly more and more outstanding women helping to build this energy transition plan while we are flying it. It's exciting to be here with a group of people who will eventually take on the baton. Thank you for having me.
It came on. All right.
Yes. Hi everyone. Thanks so much for that. Talk to start off with. I also want to make 3 points, but I guess they're quite different points. So we've got some similarities and some differences as well. I'd like to talk about research today and some of the research that we've done in the gender equality space. So it's less of a sort of personal journey and personal advice, and I guess more based on some research advice and things like that. So what I'd like to do is talk about 3 missteps that we tend to make when we do gender equality. So this is based on an article that I was asked to do for Nature magazine. So they contacted me and said, could you write us an article on, the 3 things we have to do to reach gender equality? And I said, well, if I could answer that question easily, we would be there already, right? So I decided to take a slightly different approach and talk about 3 mistakes that we often make when we try and achieve gender equality. So one is an overemphasis on quantity rather than quality. One is an approach that tries to fix women, and one is about being over-optimistic. And I'm going to touch on each of those in turn with a little bit of research sort of background on there, and then happy to expand on that when we have Q&A as well. So the first one is an overemphasis on quantity. So what I mean here is that when we talk about gender equality, we often talk about numbers. How many female professors are there in the university? How many women are on the board of such and such a company? How many women do we have in parliament or in cabinet? Or how many women are there in the energy sector, for example? So these are all really important questions. We need to know how many women are there because they're underrepresented in all of those roles. And it's important to have the data to understand that. But for me, it's also really important to go beyond the numbers. So just knowing numbers, how many women are in such and such a place is not enough because there's so much more complexity when it comes to gender equality. It's not just about representation. So some of the research that I've done really makes this point really strongly, which is the research on the glass cliff. So this is research that I've been doing for the last 20 years or so. And what it looks at is the types of positions that women go into when they take on leadership positions. So the idea here is that women are much more likely to take on leadership roles in times of crisis, when things are going badly, when things are difficult. So here are a couple of examples, just recent ones and Australian examples as well. We did some research looking at the last federal election, and it showed that the coalition and Labor to some extent were much more likely to put women in seats that were unwinnable, so that were held by the opposition by really large margins. So if you looked at the numbers of women that were being put forward, they looked reasonably impressive, but they were never going to get voted in because they were just unwinnable seats. We've got lots of other sort of corporate examples. Christine Holgate is one of them, looking at the post office and having to deal with crisis and really being, I guess, pushed out during a crisis as well. But there's lots of examples that we can find in lots of different ways. Twitter is one. If you like social media, you can see Twitter going downhill when they've got their first woman CEO. Qantas and other airlines have their first women CEOs as things are going through crisis. We've got Woolworths just happening at the moment with a female CEO during big price gouging crises as well. So what's really interesting here is this idea of, if you just look at the number of women in positions, you don't really understand the nuances that might be going on. So when are they going into these positions? What are their experiences once they're in those positions as well? So we've got all of this archival work, experimental work, case studies, qualitative work that really demonstrates this overall point that women are much more likely to be appointed in times of crisis. And why this is important is because it has a number of consequences. So one is these leadership positions are risky, they're precarious, they're stressful. Our research shows that women are much less likely to spend long periods of time in these roles. So their tenure is much shorter, they come out, they get a lot of media attention and a lot of criticism in these roles. And that's where this precarity comes through. So the metaphor of the glass cliff is really trying to get this idea that these women are really high up, they're in these senior leadership positions, but the chance of falling off is really high as well. And they're just incredibly stressful as well. So it has an impact on women's experiences in these roles and their tenure, but it doesn't just have impact on the women themselves as well. So if you are more likely to appoint women in times of crisis, there's all of this attention on them. They're much more likely to fail because things are already bad. It really runs the risk of reinforcing stereotypes. So we know that there are stereotypes out there that women are not as good at leadership as men. So then if we see women in these risky and precarious positions where it's really hard to thrive and do really well, it's not impossible. There are women who absolutely take on these roles and do brilliantly, but it's much harder to thrive in those positions. So we run the risk of reinforcing these stereotypes that women aren't good at leadership. But the other aspect is, if these women are role models for other women and they see them struggling in these roles, it also might mean that women themselves are less likely to aspire to leadership positions if this is the role models that they have. So if we put all of that together, it sort of, I hope, makes the point that if we just focus on numbers, on the quantity of women, we ignore the nature of the positions as well. And that's not just because of the glass cliff that means that women's leadership positions might be stressful or shorter or difficult, but there's a whole lot of other things where if we take any of our targets that we have that focus on numbers, it doesn't necessarily do everything that we have to do. So if we say, let's get more women on the board, but once we get them on, we don't listen to them, we don't give them good roles in those sorts of things, they're bullied and harassed or face sexual harassment, none of those things is useful if we're just talking about numbers. So we need to do things like changing culture, understanding experiences. We need to ask when and why, not just how many. Okay. So the second idea is about trying to fix women. This is where I spend a lot of my time and space at the moment. I get asked to do a lot of sort of talks and lectures and things like that at women's development or leadership development, trainings and things like that. And when you look at sorry, this is really annoying me that it doesn't have the other, sorry, just ignore that. Maybe it'll appear when I press the button next, but I don't think it's going to. That's run me totally off track. But the idea is that a lot of gender equality initiatives are really focused on women, empowering women, skilling up women, motivating women, and those sorts of things. And don't get me wrong, everyone could do with new skills, everyone could deal with being motivated, and everyone, you know, will be valued from all of those sorts of individual level interventions. But the thing is that those interventions don't fix gender inequalities, right? So a really good example of this fixing women approach is the lean in sort of approach. So this is Sheryl Sandberg. She was the chief executive officer for Facebook and then Meta. She's since stepped down from there. About 10 years ago, she published this book called Lean In. Is anyone familiar with this? So it was one of the most read books on Amazon. So you can look at all of those sorts of things on Kindle and things like that. It was one of the least finished books on Kindle. So take that as you will, but it was incredibly popular. There were lean-in circles in organizations, and there's all of these memes that go with it. So she's very much about empowering women to make good choices in their career. Fortune does favor the bold, and you'll never know what you're capable of if you don't try. If you're offered a seat on a rocket ship, you don't ask what seat, you just get on. So this is all about leaning into your career, making bold decisions, being ambitious. And great, this is empowering. We like to hear it. But there's a number of different problems that come with that. So if we're talking about this empowerment as a way to solve the gender equality problem, women's underrepresentation in particular roles, the experiences that they have in those roles, this whole empowerment approach really places the onus on women. You should be making good choices. You should be getting on rocket ships. You should be being empowered. You should be doing all of these things. But what it ignores is the continuing structural barriers that are in place. Why don't women want to get on rocket ships? You know, why are they making the choices that they make? So just telling them to do it is not enough. It also really promotes individual mobility. So we empower individual women to make the right choices, and those women, you know, go on and put themselves forward for leadership positions, which is great. But the thing is that just having a few women rise up to the top doesn't change everything. It doesn't trickle down all the way, and just because you've got a few women at the top, then everything fixes itself. And also that's a lot to ask of a few women coming into leadership roles to fix the culture and change those sorts of things. But it also means that it's particular women that often benefit from this empowerment. So it's often white, middle-class professional women who are already probably the most privileged of all the women that benefit from this sort of lean in. And all in all, it leaves the status quo untouched. So it's encouraging women in some ways to fit into organizations, to act a bit more like men, and then thrive in those organizations without actually changing those organizations themselves. So when I was in the UK, I moved back to Australia relatively recently. I ran a big 5-year project kind of looking at this, and I'm not going to go through all of those studies. But the arguments that we really made and the data that we collected made the point that our ambition or our willingness to make sacrifices or the degree to which we're empowered doesn't occur within a social vacuum, but rather the choices that women make to get on rocket ships or whatever it is are really shaped and constrained by context and by society and organizational culture. So women will be ambitious if they're encouraged to be ambitious, right? Not just on the outset by saying you should be ambitious, but when they have role models, when they're treated well, when they're respected, and when people listen to them as well. So we've done a whole lot of work that shows that women's confidence and ambition is very much related to how they're treated in the workplace, whether they've got role models, whether they've got people that believe in them, whether they get resources, but also the negative treatment that they receive. So women really decrease their levels of ambition when they're treated badly in the workplace. So organizations really need to provide cultures and context that fuels women's ambition rather than stymieing them. So instead of telling women to lean in, we've actually got to give them something to lean towards instead. So the last one, the last of the 3 points that I wanted to make was about over-optimism. For anyone that's met me before, I'm probably a relentlessly optimistic person. It's annoying, I know. But when it comes to this gender equality piece, it's actually the case that we sometimes are overly optimistic about how much progress we've made and probably underestimate how much still needs to be done. And it's always this balance, because I think optimism is good, it's motivating. But if it makes you think, oh, it's all like, hey, it's fine, we don't really need to do anything, then it's problematic. I'm writing a laureate about this right at the moment. So it's in my head with it at the moment. So this is a big grant that you can get from the Australian Research Council. So I want to just give you one example of a study that we did within the veterinary profession. Don't feel like you need to read this, it's just an example. So in the veterinary profession, it's really interesting because it's historically a very male-dominated space. So think all creatures, great and small, kind of, you know, that country vet in a tweed hat kind of thing. Maybe no one knows that, but maybe that's an outdated example. But about 80% of veterinary students at the moment are women. So it's an area where it's really, really changing. But interestingly, there's still large pay gaps. Women are dropping out at really great rates. And if you look at leadership roles, then women are really underrepresented in those roles. So it's an interesting space where change is happening, but there's still much to be done. So what we did was to say, well, what happens when people think that discrimination is no longer a problem? And what's really interesting is when you look at the vet profession and you look at managerial vets and you say, look, is gender equality a problem? They're always like, no, it's not a problem anymore. Look at all these women coming through. There's a big pipeline. It's fine. So we did a survey with vets who were managers. They all had good experience there. About 50% of them were women, had lots of experience looking at people. And what we did was we sort of made up a form, which was, we said, this is an annual review form for a junior vet. They've just started at a practice. Here's an example of how they've been evaluated. And what we did is for every second person that filled out the thing, we either said, this junior vet's name is Elizabeth, or this junior vet's name is Mark. But everything else was exactly the same. And then we said, okay, can you ask a number of questions now that you've read this? What would you advise for Mark? How much would you pay Mark or Elizabeth? How would you evaluate Mark or Elizabeth? And how would you treat them if you were their boss, Mark or Elizabeth? Now, what's really interesting here is then we also asked them, do you think discrimination is still a problem in the veterinary profession? Okay. So what we find is that when people say it's no longer a problem, there's no problem with gender discrimination in our field, in our sector, the more that you agree with that statement, the more likely you are to pay Mark more than Elizabeth, okay? So if we look here, these are people that think, maybe there's not, it's neither a problem or not a problem. This is the more they agree with that. And this is the pay disparity, the more they agree with that. So when people say it's not a problem, they're actually the ones that show the most discrimination. When you ask them to evaluate Elizabeth compared to Mark, those that think it's no longer a problem evaluate Elizabeth as less competent. And then they're also less likely to treat her well in the workplace. They say they'll provide her with fewer opportunities relative to Mark, offer her less encouragement, and express more reservation. So there's a real paradox here, right? So the people that don't recognize that there's still a problem in the profession are more likely to perpetuate the problem that's there. So there's a real failure to recognize ongoing discrimination, and this failure to recognize it is actually associated with more discrimination. And we've done other work in the medical profession that shows that if you are overly optimistic, you're much less likely to support gender equality initiatives as a whole. So just to conclude, my 3 points that also Monique beautifully did, rounding out her talk as well. Numbers are not enough. So quantity of women versus the quality of the positions that are there. We should be thinking about both of these things. Fixing women doesn't tackle the root of the problem and it doesn't lead to systemic change. And we need to celebrate wins, but over-optimism is associated with discrimination and stymies change as well. Thanks so much.
Do we use this mic, Alex? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Excellent. This one? Yeah. Thank Thank you. Thank you both for very fascinating talks. I really enjoyed those, and I've got about a million questions for you both. I think you should start by doing one of your studies in the engineering
Okay.
context.
Done.
Because there we've got, lots of challenges. Perhaps I'll just open up to the audience in a minute, but I'll start by asking you each a question from myself. So this is more of a numbers question for you, Monique. So do you have the numbers around with your projects that are invested in by CEFC, what percentage would be led by women? Do you have those numbers at hand? Or do you have a feeling if you don't have the actual numbers?
So I don't have the numbers. What I can say, that I was 18 years into my career before I saw my first all-female banking syndicate. So there were 3 women that happened to be leading that group. Every other syndicate I'd been in was me and a man. And then there's one investment where all of the different counterparties, from the landholder to the EPC contractor to the investors were all female, and in fact we named the project companies with a Ms. in front of them just for posterity, so that everyone would have to puzzle over it for the 30-year of the project life as to why that. So I don't have the figures, but it's the vast majority of still.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you another question. I really enjoyed your storytelling, and it's so lovely that your parents see to hear the story. It's really, very lovely. Do we need more storytellers in the energy industry?
Absolutely. So I work with people who are incredibly good with numbers, incredibly quick at coming to very sensible conclusions, who struggle to make their points to people who need to make decisions. A lot of people still work in words and they work in concepts, and the ability to tell the story as to why the numbers are important and why the data is important is really, really compelling. So I absolutely think it's an undervalued skill in the finance industry and energy.
I guess I was just thinking about it in the context of the fact that there's always a lot of discussion around engineering and getting students into engineering, and the federal government is trying to promote those pathways, but not a lot into studying literature or English. And so, do you think that's something that we should be more focused on as an industry, prioritizing that?
I think it's around diversity generally and diversity of thinking styles. I think it's important that not all engineers have to be didactic in the numbers, massively opinionated around numbers themselves. I think there will be others that will come from other pathways in life. And in fact, in an organization, you need all of the skill sets. And I think sometimes we do lean far too heavily into one section, and it can affect the culture at the top, where if you're not a deeply 30-year skill set engineer with exactly that CV and exactly that sector, that you're not valued in terms of leadership qualities. So I think it's around diversity of thinking styles generally. Yeah, not sure necessarily we need to train more engineers in Australian film.
I have a response to that as well. Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree. And I think we've spent a lot of time and energy, so either at a policy level or at an institutional level, trying to get more women into STEM or into engineering. And I think that's critical. It's absolutely critical. But what we don't do is the flip side of that, to try and get more men into other sorts of areas as well, because you can't try and rebalance one area without rebalancing the other. And I think one of the things that is problematic is what we try and do is say, look, there's a whole lot of sectors, careers or jobs that are really important that women should get into. And what that sometimes unintentionally does is devalue the work that women are already doing. So in the care economy or in other areas and things like that. And I think we need to do both of those things alongside each other. So absolutely, the value of STEM is there and the value of engineering is there. Let's get more women in there. But the other thing is, we don't want to just take all women and just move them into areas and say, this is what's important. We need to value things like literature or psychology, where I'm from, or all sorts of care sorts of things as well. And that might be about raising salaries, it might be raising the value and the status that we put on those. And I think both of those things need to come together. Now, I don't think that's something that the sector itself has to bother about, but I think it needs to go alongside those changes as well.
Yeah, I was quite upset that you criticised Sheryl Sandberg.
I like that one too.
But what you just said now reminded me of what I did like about her book, and I agree with the criticism that you have. But one point that she did make was that just like she's promoting that women lean into careers that they haven't traditionally been represented in, but men lean in to work at home and in the child rearing and family responsibilities. So that makes me think of that with you talking about men, leaning in possibly. Yeah, you might not like that term for other industries as well.
Yeah.
But let me open up the floor to questions. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Oh gosh.
No, it's just a general thing. You've been talking about engineering, bankers, high class people. I have noticed more recently that apprenticeships are being taken more seriously by females and accepted by the males. And if you go around any of the building sites now, you see a lot of female apprentices doing a great job. Keep it up.
Yeah, that's a really useful comment. Thanks for that. I have heard so I'm in the engineering school, and we're now at a really not very great level of women in studying engineering, about 25%, so it's still quite low. And I have heard that women find it quite challenging to go out into the industry, and you might have a female engineer leading a team of blokes, and it's challenging for them. And we do see a lot of women drop out of the industry.
If these blokes are being turned more into women, then a lot more equality happen.
Hopefully.
Comments?
I think that's right. That's one nice example. One of the building companies that we've worked with in the solar industry, largely male-dominated construction, slinging solar panels, but they actually made a really concerted effort after being told for years that they couldn't find women apprentices, even though they would like to find them, they just weren't out there. They made a really concerted effort, and they actually went hunting for working single mums, and they had to then accommodate childcare responsibilities and other things, but it was actually just being really conscious about it, and that was driven by a team of men. So I think there are good examples.
Yeah, there's another really good example of a company that, again, not engineering, but did a lot of warehouse work and things like that. And they were like, we can never get women. We advertise for women, no women apply. And then they realized that one of the selection criteria that they had was a forklift driver's license, and women historically just don't have those. So what they did was they just took that criteria off, and they said, well, we can teach people how to drive forklifts. Like, this is not rocket science, like we can do it. And they got to 50-50 almost immediately. So part of it is also saying, what are the criteria that are really needed for this job, and what is core and what is a nice to have, and what can you teach on the job and what can you not? So there's really important, easy ways in which you can make changes in these areas.
I have a question from online.
We have a couple of questions from the online audience. One is directed to Michelle. Any thoughts about why women are put into C-suite roles during times of crisis within the institution? And then we've got one maybe from Monique here from Lucy Wellington. What are the current workforce challenges for women in energy, and how are these predicted to change in the future?
Okay, I have lots of thoughts on the sort of causes and those sorts of things, and we've spent the last 20 years really looking at that research. I didn't want to bombard you with sort of data, but it's multiply determined, so there's lots of things going on. It's just not one simple thing. One of the things is it's just setting women up for failure. So in some situations, I'm thinking of a political one with Theresa May coming into the Prime Ministership in the UK. So massive crisis, Brexit, all sorts of things happening, I've never seen men run in the opposite direction from leadership as I did after post-Brexit as well. So Theresa May sort of the last woman standing while everyone else goes, this is not my sort of thing. And then once it starts to be fixed a little bit, they will come running back in. So part of it is that men are just like, that's a crisis, I don't want it, and leave it for someone else to sort out. Or someone goes, that's going to be pretty bad for your career, I'm not going to take that on, leaving a woman to take that on. Now, Theresa May's not stupid. She was like, I know this is a crisis. Could I run in the other direction? But she knew that that's probably her only opportunity to ever be Prime Minister. So she sort of sucked it up and said, yeah, okay, I'll do that. So there's a little bit about men not wanting it and women saying this is the only opportunity. There's some research that we've done that shows that it signals change. So if there's a big crisis, it's often really visible to the public or to shareholders or other stakeholders and things like that. So you often want to signal that you're doing something a little bit differently. So think about Barnaby Joyce stepping down from Qantas amid a whole lot of drama, Vanessa Hudson coming in and just sort of saying, we're doing things really differently, right? You know, this is going to be different. We're trying to change things around. So it sort of signals change that things are different. And then the last theory that's out there that actually there's not a lot of evidence for is that women are just good at dealing with crisis. We should give it to women because they're really good at crisis. When you actually look at the data and things like that, that's not what people are thinking. So they're thinking much more that they'll be good scapegoats or signal change rather than they'll actually bring about change as well. So lots of things that are going on there.
To the question about challenges for women in the energy industry, I think we've talked about the bottom-up challenge just by the numbers. There's fewer women that are looking very hard in their high school careers for engineering and finance roles necessarily. So I think it's about publicising the successful examples of that. I also think there is a risk that there are a lot of glass cliffs in the energy transition. You know, it's going to be ugly. There'll be mistakes made. We're all flying the plane, and you know there are some incredibly successful, high-profile women in those sectors making decisions. Should something go wrong, I think there is a risk that there'll be a perception that it was because people kind of played the woman card and took the woman risk, and that's why it went wrong. And in fact, that's probably got nothing to do with anything. I am, on the flip side, I'm really inspired. I think there's one good example of a woman that was appointed to a very important senior position, not at a time of conflict, which is Shamara Ramayaki from Macquarie Bank. And she has been a very powerful advocate for climate generally and also gender equality. But that, for me, she talks about her career as if she says it's not that you can't be what you can't see, which I strongly believe, but she said sometimes it's you can't be what you won't see, and sometimes the decision makers see women in their organisation, they can't perceive that they could be leaders because they're not 6 foot tall men with deep voices, and they just have this instinct that they're not leaders. And I think Macquarie is, you know, it's very sharp financially, but they're very good at throwing clever people at problems, and that has created opportunity for women within their ranks. And she's one of the some evidence of how that has worked successfully.
Monique, any more questions from the audience?
Thanks, Monique and Michelle. I was just wondering if you think that it's been great that there has been so much focus on getting women into STEM to increase the participation of women in traditionally non-female-led industries. But do you think that kind of leads to a devaluing of those alternative skills, like a woman coming into the finance industry with, literature background or a law degree, and it doesn't allow people to think about what those women with those like different skill sets can actually bring to a finance organization or an engineering organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a problem, and I see it even in the way that that I recruit. I go straight for the people that are really good at financial modeling, and that's not necessarily me back at that stage of my career. Still, maybe. So yeah, I think being able to find people, women within the organisation that have strong communication skills, that are clever, that can learn to be a forklift driver, that can learn to run a financial model is really important. It's incumbent upon men in those organisations to just think more laterally when they say, I can't find a woman for this job. There's probably 4 or 5 women that you know that with the right training and the right opportunities, they could take that job, but it is about thinking laterally.
Yeah, and I think the really important thing about that is that those are the decisions that change culture as well. So if you just say, let's just get more women in, but don't do anything else to change it, then you've still got a particularly masculine culture that women have to adapt to. So whereas if you say, okay, what does our culture want to be like? And what do we value? And what's important? And what are the skills that are critical and not? And I'm not saying we should lower the bar to allow women in. It's absolutely not doing that. It's about saying what are the skills that we value and are important, and actually, critical thinking and, communication skills and person skills and all of those things are critical across the way. And it's about what we value versus not. I mean, the similar thing can be said about leadership roles and things like that. What do we want our leaders to look like? Do we want to just keep going the same old leaders over and over again? Or do we want to say, actually, we want compassion and morality and all of these things in leadership? And those are the things that we should be hiring for alongside all of these other skills as well.
Any other question? I'll ask you a question in the meantime. I wonder, Michelle, if you have any advice for our institute. So we're the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. And you talked about the importance of not focusing on numbers. So for us as an institute, what specific metrics do you think we should consider, to make sure that we are considering, diversity, but also about avoiding putting people in this position of the glass cliff as well?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think don't not look at numbers. Like numbers is really important, and that's a good source of data to be able to work from, and having that as a metric from which you can measure progress and things like that. But I think looking at other metrics as well, and sometimes, there's always the thing about if you don't measure it, it's just not going to happen, right? So some of those things are saying, well, what is our culture like? What is going to attract women to come and to stay, which is the really critical thing. What is going to allow women to thrive and those sorts of things. And so, rather than giving concrete examples here, I mean, some examples from other areas. So I did a big piece of work in the finance sector when I lived in the UK, and we did over 6 months, we did these really great seminar series where we got academics and industry people to talk about barriers and how we overcome them and everything like that. We had a final wrap-up meeting for the whole team to say, okay, how are we going to put this forward? How are we going to turn this into policy? And someone from the finance side of things organised a big lunch that we had, and they set it up, and it was in a men's club. So, and it was in like the functions room of a men's club, which was downstairs, and it was this big black table and had big leather chairs. And when I sat at the table, it felt like the table came to about here. And then on the walls all around was very tasteful, artful photos of naked women. Like, tasteful, they're arty, but naked women. And I was just like, why are we here? Like, and they said, oh, we have all of our events here. We've got a good deal with the club. And I was just like, okay, and I'm not suggesting that that's what you do at all. But those are those sorts of things that is just part of a culture where, those are the things that exclude women, right? So thinking about, well, how is it that we make our culture more inclusive for women? So is that about where our core meeting times are? So at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we always have our core meetings between basically 10 and 2:30, so that anyone that needs to do the school run or anything like that never misses out on core meetings. We do flexible working, we have a really supportive atmosphere. We try and lift each other up and all of those sorts of things. So I think there's lots of things around culture change that you can sort of do. But the other one is also just about when you think about numbers, it's not just the numbers at the top and things like that. It's about retention rates for numbers, for example. It's about job satisfaction rates. It's about take up of flexible working and things like that. So you can offer flexible working, but if people don't feel like they can take it, because none of the senior people work flexibly. So if I really want to get ahead, I'm not going to take it as well. So you've not only have to have the policies in there, but you've got to model that this is appropriate sort of thing as well. So, yeah. And I'm sorry, I know that's not a really like, here are 3 things that you can do and it's going to fix it. But that's because it's much harder to do that. And there's no 3 easy sort of tick box things. You have to look at your culture and your organization and where the barriers are and make those changes really specifically for what you do and who you want to attract and retain.
That's really helpful, insightful. Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Do we have time for one more question, Alex, from me? If there none from the audience. So this is for Monique, and it's actually really related to what you were just talking about, Michelle, because I was really interested in how you were talking about with the energy industry. A lot of what we do is just around winging it and sort of bluffing, and
Not very comfortable for an engineer.
it's not comfortable for an engineer. And I think, is it true to say it's less comfortable for women to do that? I'm interested in your thoughts on whether that is something that's more challenging. I mean, without wanting to stereotype or group people or anything, but I wonder if that is a particular challenge in our industry.
Well, I think Michelle will know the data better than me, but I think there's a lot of analysis about how confident women need to be that they have all the skills before they will even put themselves forward for the role. And in fact, if I ask my kids' age, boys and girls, whether they're good at tennis, and the girls will be like, oh no, I'm not very good. Whereas in fact they could be, national champion, and she'd still say, sometimes I play, and little boys will be like, oh, I'm excellent, and maybe they've picked up a racket once. So I think sometimes that can lead to men being more willing to put themselves forward for positions in the first place. And I also, I think it's, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
About whether it's hard for women to wing it.
Yeah, I think therefore women do tend to admit more. So they have this, they tend to admit more that they are feeling overwhelmed, or they are feeling the challenges, and it's not yet necessarily very safe for men to admit that, and nor is it safe for women. Let's just be clear. In fact, sometimes I saw this article in the AFR where there was a woman venture capital investor, and she had invested in something alongside 90% of other capital run by men investors, and invested in something that had gone wrong. And they dug up this YouTube video of her where she was being interviewed at a panel like this, and she had said she was, she would lie awake at night questioning her decisions, and she felt really strongly about it, and she was kind of chronically feeling stressed about whether or not she'd make the right decision. And they threw this back at her after one investment went wrong, and they didn't even, question any of the men that had been involved in this investment. And I thought that was really interesting, that expressing that vulnerability years ago for her had come back to bite her later on, when it was a nice tagline for an article about something that had gone wrong. So I do think there is risk in women in being vulnerable, but on the other hand, I think that it's disingenuous to pretend like we all know what we're doing, because we can't. There's no way that all the men can know what they're doing, and there's certainly no way all the women can.
Thanks for that. If there are any more questions from the audience or online, perhaps I'll wrap up, but I've got a question. Oh, you can first ask Alex.
Just following on from the last question and some of the things that Michelle was saying earlier around fixing women, it's great, these initiatives to encourage women to be more confident, but is there also benefit in initiatives encouraging men to be less confident, or to be willing to say, I don't know that, or it's okay to not have all the answers? Is this something that you've ever encountered? Do you think it's something that could be beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting thing. There's a book that a former journalist wrote called Lean Out. So it's the sort of flip side of lean in, and that instead of telling women to lean in, maybe tell men to lean out a little bit, right? And sometimes that might mean stepping back, or giving a place for another woman, or things like that. But sometimes it is about doing things like admitting vulnerability, or admitting that you're wrong. And the thing with confidence is really interesting. We often talk about women not being confident enough, but the other side of that is it that men are overconfident? And is confidence a good thing per se? So that's all comes back to questioning the criteria by which we evaluate people and value people and all of those sorts of things as well. The other thing to say is that if women are seen as lacking confidence, why is that? And there's a lot of evidence that shows that they're often held to a higher standard. So we know that that men are often hired and promoted based on their potential to make change, whereas women is much more on what they've already demonstrated in the past. So they always have to show, I've already done this, like I can do this, and men are just like, oh yeah, I can totally do that. Just let me do that as well. So yeah, and the only other thing I would say is in the spirit of recognizing mistakes. Barnaby Joyce is nothing to do with Qantas, and I got my Joyces mixed up there as well. So just as I was saying it, I was like, oh Joyce, sorry. So I'll admit that now.
In some ways, Barnaby's quite good at admitting his mistakes.
Real good. All right. Well, perhaps I will wrap it up there on that note. And thank you both so much for your insights and sharing your stories, which I really enjoyed. And thank you to the audience for coming along. Thanks to Alex for organising everything, and to Genevieve as well. And yeah, thanks also for the audience joining online. So we'll wrap it up there. Thank you.